Hello and welcome to episode 131 of the Book Binge, the final one of my 2023 reading tier lists, which is really weird for me to be saying out loud because it doesn't feel like it was that long ago that I recorded the 5 reading tier list videos for 2022, but that was a year ago now that I recorded those videos, so it just feels really strange. 2023 flew by, and the fact that I'm recording all these at the end of December to come out over the first, little over month of 2023 or 2024 rather. I'm gonna have a hard time talking about years properly. It's just everything is super crazy. Time is kind of an illusion, but not your time right now. I want to respect it a little bit, so I'm going to try to make this as short as I possibly can. Let's talk about the rest of the books that I read in 2023 and how I would rank them on this tier list, kind of relative to all of the other ones. The next book that I'm going to be starting off with for today is Mapping the Interior by Stephen Graham Jones. Last time I talked about both Night of the Mannequins and then a little bit later The Only Good Indians. You can see where they are placed here. I'm actually going to go ahead and put, I'm going to keep that there because that's a favorite. Whatever. Mapping the Interior is the next book that I'm going to talk about. This was a book that, based off of how I felt with Night of the Mannequins and The Only Good Indians, people assumed I would either like the best of SGJ's books up to that point, or that I would like the least. And I've got to say, I didn't enjoy this too much. This was another really, really short book, like barely over 100 pages again, maybe 110, 115 or something like that. And I really liked the first 15 or 20 pages of it. I felt super into the head of the main character. There are certain ways in which he discussed and talked about handling grief and kind of the depiction of that, especially in losing a family member and the desperation that a person can have when they're trying to go through that, essentially, the desperation trying to get that person back when it's impossible. I thought was fantastic. I loved that a lot, but the rest of the book didn't go in any direction that I really enjoyed, didn't really do things that I enjoyed, and didn't really do things that I thought made sense for the story. I wanted this to be a little bit more of that internal character exploration rather than doing whatever the heck it was that it actually did. With that being said, I think I could reread Mapping the Interior. I read it in just one day, on the day that I read it, so I think I could spend like 1 or maybe 2 days rereading it at some point in the future and maybe enjoy it a little bit more since I have a better idea of kind of what it is now. But as of that first read, I didn't enjoy this one, and although I feel a little bit more ambivalent now towards it than I did at first, which was a little bit more negative, I had problems with this book that I actually related to both Night of the Mannequins and The Only Good Indians, justifying why I didn't really appreciate this one as much. I'm going to go ahead and put this here in the excuse me what part of the video, just above the road, because it had more than I enjoyed. I enjoyed those first 15 and 20 pages so much, whereas I did not enjoy much of the road, and there were no moments of that I would have said I loved. So it, barely makes it above the road here. I wanted to enjoy this more. Maybe I'll enjoy it more on another reread, but it was kind of a miss for me. But what was really a miss for me was Flesh Boy. This book was terrible. It was actually so bad. But I say that because it actually was kind of just like very middle of the road in literally every possible respect. And as such, I felt so disconnected from it that I hated it because of how disconnected I felt from it. I was so disconnected from the story and the plot of Flesh Boy and the character work and the setting and everything that even the gross stuff that should have made me feel absolutely disgusting and want to throw up did not yield any reaction from me because of how little I cared about the book. So this was the first and so far only 1-star rating that I think I've put on my Goodreads. So it is easily at the very bottom of this list. In fact, I could, kind of cheat and put another row below excuse me what and just call it Flesh Boy and put Flesh Boy in there, and that would justify how I feel about it. I don't hate this book as much as I say hate The Road, but like I said, because I was so aggressively indifferent to Flesh Boy, it has made me hate it. So that is basically how I feel about it. I regret finishing this book when I DNF'd it initially, so that is how I feel about this. Anyways, let's move on to a much better book, Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, with great prose, and that, while not necessarily as fantastic as I remembered it being or as the pedestal that I put it on when I read it initially as a junior in high school, Fahrenheit 451 is really good, and while not necessarily the most relevant of the big four dystopian novels, so to speak, as I think that, say, Brave New World is, that Brave New World is very relevant, even if I didn't really enjoy reading that one, Fahrenheit 451 does have stuff that I think is more relevant than I initially remembered it being, but a lot of it is more of a character study in certain regards that I wish it was a little bit more. I don't know how to make this make a little bit more sense, but I think the first act of the book was fantastic and had a character in it that does not appear through the rest of the book, that I wanted a lot more of that character, and sort of the character exploration between Montag as the main character and this other character was like my favorite stuff in the book, and I just wanted there to be a little bit more of that. So while not a perfect book, it is a very good book, and I'm going to go ahead and put this, oh man, I don't think I liked this more than, say, I liked 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, for example. I do think it's a better book, and so I'm kind of balancing these two together in that way here. Next up is The Lesser Devil and Other Stories. This was a reread because I had already read Lesser Devil and Tales of the Sun Eater Volume 1 both last year, or rather in 2022 rather than in 2023, and I thought that this reread was a lot more of a slog than my first read of either of those books, but a lot of that was because my rereads of Sun Eater has been greatly related to proofreading, copy editing, doing a second pass on some of these in preparation for Diamond Editions and other stuff like that, as well as I think reprints for Enderita special editions of these books, but I'm not 100% sure on that part, so don't take my word for it. I've just been doing this voluntarily as kind of like a, I just kind of want to do this for Christopher, so I've been doing this. And Lesser Devil and Tales 1 were by far the most typo and problem-ridden pieces of work that Christopher has published, and that's because the original copy editor on those, on that novella and that short story collection did not do a good job. It's just, quite frankly, like, that's just the honest truth of the situation. There's very bad job, hundreds of edits as opposed to maybe a few dozen for any of the other pieces of work that I've covered. This was very messy, and as such was much more of a slog to actually get through, and I think I actively enjoyed The Lesser Devil and Tales Volume 1 a little bit less than I think I remember doing, just because of how much of a slog doing that copy work was just for these stories. So while I do enjoy them a lot, and there are a couple stories that I do think really hold up still, I'm going to go ahead and put this like at the very bottom of pretty dang good, because, it's still good stuff. I just had a hard time enjoying it as much because I was just having to catch so many errors in there. Majority is another arc that I got in the middle of the year that I actually read like a couple parts of over the late summer, early autumn period of 2023, and then did not have a chance to continue for a very long time. In fact, the only reason I managed to finish this was because I picked up the audiobook for very cheap over Cyber Monday and decided that I would finish the book that way, because that was the only way that it was going to get continued anytime soon in the foreseeable future. So I did get through that, and there was stuff in the first act of this book that I really loved, that I thought was really good and, was cool exploration of certain stuff. But most of the rest of the book was kind of hit or miss depending on what it was doing. I think this book as a story is more of a 3 out of 5. And since that's most of what most readers focus on when they're reading a book, is like the actual story and the character stuff itself like that, it's not my favorite thing, but it's also not my least favorite thing. I thought it was good for what it was, and I do want to continue the series at some point, just definitely won't make it a priority. But a lot of my problem with the book came down to it feeling like the first book in 3 rather than the first book in 6, which is what it is. So I've no idea how this author could manage to make this story 6 books. I could be surprised reading future books, discovering how it is that Abby's able to do that, but I thought that was quite strange, and then there were certain decisions that were otherwise made that, like I said, story-wise, I didn't really love. Most of the thing that made me appreciate this book a little bit more was mostly its thematic work. It has a lot of different dichotomies of thematic exploration, a lot of those relating to liberty and slavery and justice and majority systems, as the case may be. There's a lot of stuff that is explored in here, including stuff like, mercy and justice, essentially. So there's a lot of correlating, like, thematic factors that have a huge part and the underlying nature of the story that I thought were cool and were explored surprisingly well for the most part, but the story itself wasn't necessarily fully my favorite, so because of that, I'm going to put this in better luck next time and probably below a lot of the other stuff in here. Probably somewhere around here. I'm actually going to go ahead and move Tales Volume 1 up, or Volume 2 up a couple, because that actually feels a little bit more right to me. But yeah, majority was a book that I enjoyed, and wouldn't necessarily not recommend, but I wouldn't necessarily fully recommend it either, because it's hard to recommend a book that has a 3 out of 5 story, even if it has like a 4 or 4.5 out of 5, you know, sort of thematic exploration within the story. But because those themes are so tied to the story, it's hard to recommend it for the themes, because the story itself is a little bit less good, you know? Like I said, it's a little bit complicated in that regard. Next up is No Country for Old Men, a book that I'm surprised I even gave a shot in the first place because of how much I disliked The Road, and how much I dislike The Road because of how I've talked about it so far, even, you know, just kind of, you know, even just causing it to catch strays in the way that I talked about Flush Boy, for example. But No Country for Old Men I did immersively on recommendation from Aloe, as opposed to eyeball reading, which I did for The Road. With that being said, I don't know if I would be able to enjoy The Road, or if I would have enjoyed The Road more if I did that immersively or on audio versus my eyeball read of it, but I did do No Country for Old Men immersively, mostly audio actually, but a little bit of immersive. That made it a lot easier to ignore the problems that I have with the prose, even though I do still have problems with the prose and Cormac McCarthy's absolute disregard for the, you know, English language or the written language as anything, because he would do the same thing if it was any other language, except I don't think he could get away with doing this in any other language without being in big trouble for it. But, you know, what do I know about writing? Apparently Cormac McCarthy's a genius for throwing everything out the window. My English, you know, my perfect score in the English and ACT doesn't mean anything, apparently. But, you know, that's mostly just me being salty, and I don't think I actually had a perfect score. I had nearly a perfect score. But whatever. The point stands. There are still problems with the prose, but the actual story itself and the characters and the setting of No Country for Old Men all worked for me a million times better than The Road did. I was actually connected to stuff, so much so that I was devastated by a couple reveals near the end of this book because of how much I was connected to those moments and some of those scenes. And the dialogue is a lot better than The Road as well, where I could not give less of a crap about the characters of The Road, because the dialogue is so bad, because nobody talks to each other that way. Nobody would, nobody does, nobody ever will talk to each other that way. It's just so inherently unrealistic and bad. But No Country for Old Men actually feels like real conversations, even in spite of them being written very poorly because of, you know, the lack of grammar and punctuation stuff in the actual writing itself. But I enjoyed No Country for Old Men a lot. I'm going to stop ranting about the problems that I had with McCarthy and with the book, and just tell you that the story itself is incredible. I'm actually going to go ahead and put this at cream of the crop, even though I only rated this 4 out of 5. I really, really enjoyed No Country for Old Men, and made me change my mind about trying more of McCarthy in general. I actually kind of want to try all of his books because he doesn't have that many books, and doing an immersive / audio only experience might help me to enjoy them a little bit more. Maybe I'll reread The Road later with an immersive or audio only experience later, and notice that maybe I enjoyed a little bit more after having experienced more of McCarthy's work. But No Country for Old Men was definitely a huge shift, and really, really surprised me as such. It's one of my biggest surprises of the year, hands down. Next up is Queen of Mid-Ashes and Other Stories. Now, I did read Tales of the Sun Eater Volume 2 for the first time in 2023 over the first few days, but Queen of Mid-Ashes and Other Stories was one of the last things that I read. There was a point in the very middle of December or sometime, I don't remember for sure, where I actually just like finally picked it up. Was just like, okay, I'm going to go ahead and start on this because I want to be done with Queen of Mid-Ashes and Other Stories before 2024, and it happened. I read all of Tales Volume 2 in one day, after having done Queen of Mid-Ashes a couple months prior. And these were a lot more clean than The Lesser Devil and Tales Volume 1 were, so doing the copy stuff was a little bit less annoying for this collection than the first one, and I think I decide I like Queen of Mid-Ashes and Tales Volume 2 both maybe a little bit more than I thought I did upon this reread. It's part of the reason why I've moved this up a little bit, the independent Tales Volume 2 item here, because of the reread, and I think as such I might actually be inclined to put this at the top of Better Luck Next Time now, because it's not quite in that pretty dang good, you know, category, and maybe I should rename these sections so they kind of mean a little bit more of what I actually want them to, rather than these, but whatever, it doesn't really matter. The naming conventions don't really make a difference. But yeah, I really enjoyed Queen of Midashes and Other Stories more than I thought I would upon this reread. Queen was a lot better to me upon the reread because it has a lot of references to Kingdoms of Death specifically that are like, oh wow, yeah, those are really cool references that I never would have caught or noticed at all upon my first read, but I did on the reread, and it was just really cool. And then Tales Volume 2 has a lot of material that I just kind of underrated upon my first time reading it, so I'm gonna go ahead and put this... I don't know, man, like, if we're talking about this reread experience specifically, Queen of Midashes and Other Stories was better than Lesser Devil and Other Stories because of how much of a slog copy editing this one was, but this one wasn't that bad, so I was able to enjoy the writing a little bit more, and it made me enjoy it a little bit more. So I guess that's kind of where I'm going to go ahead and put those stories. Next up was an audio-only read, my first Tim Powers book, and it was probably not the best place to start with Tim Powers because this was more of a modern-day story, and apparently what he does really good is his more like historical fiction, sort of fantasy-esque kind of stuff, so this was definitely not the best place to start, but it was a fine book. I would probably put this... It's either here at the very bottom of Better Luck Next Time or at the very beginning of Excuse Me What, because it was kind of fine. I had a lot of problems with it, but I also had a lot of things that I enjoyed about it. I think I'll have to develop more of a full opinion on this book as I continue with that trilogy, which I'll probably do in 2024. But I might actually just keep this in the Excuse Me What, just under Malice, because I enjoyed Alternate Routes more. Don't get me wrong, I enjoyed this more than Malice or The Time Machine, and maybe even more than Majority, but there are certain things about it that are just like, you know, big question marks that make it hard to really put above other stuff. And I feel more of a desire to read Valor, for instance, than I do the next book in this trilogy, or at least I might do Valor before I do the next book in this trilogy. But since one of them's physical and one of them's audio only, that actually makes a huge difference in when I'll decide to do that. I'll probably do the next Tim Powers book before I do Valor, but I would like to do Valor before I do the next one of those. But regardless, this is just kind of getting into the weeds of reading plans, and I'm getting tired recording this at this point. But yeah, this is kind of where I'm going to put this, even though I don't think it's worse than some of the other books that are above it. And I think that some of the other books that are above it are worse than it is, but I think this is a good place because this is kind of where my feelings on it rest at this point. It's just kind of like, I'm not really sure, quite frankly. But next up is The Shadow Rising. This is going to, you know, cause a lot of problems because a lot of people don't love my opinion on Shadow Rising, because it's my least favorite of the it's my least favorite of the Wheel of Time so far by a huge margin. Even though it has probably the most emotionally impactful scene of the series so far, it also has several scenes that are by far handily the worst of the series, like without question. And I think the fact that this is propped up as basically the best book in the series has me uber confused, because The Dragon Reborn is fantastic, but it is severely underrated amongst the fans of the series. A lot of people put it near, you know, like the bottom half, basically near where the slog is. That and Eye of the World actually are both very underrated by most people. And I think The Great Hunt is a little bit overrated, and I think The Shadow Rising is quite overrated. I'm going to put this in Better Luck Next Time, even under some of these other books like this. That's probably where I'm going to put The Shadow Rising, because although it is a really good book, part of the reason that I didn't really like it as much is because of one particular character actually really ruined certain scenes, and a certain storyline were really starting to grate on me at various points, but also because the climax was not very good, and because the climax wasn't really expected in any way. Part of the reason why I enjoyed The Dragon Reborn, as I said in the video that I talked about it, was not just because it had a really great climax and resolution, but because the entire book culminated in what that became. The Shadow Rising, the climax came literally out of nowhere. Like, just out of nowhere. Well, the climax for Rand's plotline, which was basically the climax of the book, but you know what I mean. What happened was so confusing that I wasn't really into it until after it was over, so it was hard to really be like, okay. And then after the fact, I was like, okay, that was actually kind of cool, and that has cool implications for the rest of the series, but because I was so out of it for the entire duration of that little battle sequence, that I just didn't really enjoy it that much. And the fact that, like I said, this is regarded as the best of the series by plenty of people is like a major question mark for me, because even if I had enjoyed the climax, it definitely was, like I said, out of nowhere, and it was really rushed. So like, how can something like this, for someone who tends to like endings and good endings and resolutions more than most other things I enjoy in a book, how can somebody like me think that the Shadow Rising, as a book that does not culminate in its ending at all, over, you know, Dragon Reborn? How could I think that? So that's basically where my feeling shows up, but I think people are gonna flip tables over that opinion. But that is fine. Now, for the final book that I finished in 2024, Return to Adan by Philip Chase, the third book in the Adan trilogy. I loved this thing. This brought back the magic that I really loved about The Way of Adan. It was really good. The fact that the Prophet of Adan has the climax that people would expect to be the climax of the third book in a trilogy, but doesn't, means that Return to Adan is actually dealing with all of the various plot lines that weren't finished in the first two books, and there were a lot of them, and it even sort of halfway introduced one. And I say halfway for a very important reason that I can't say because of spoilery reasons. But the book is just so good. And the last like 50 pages of Return to Adan, maybe even the last 60 pages, my eyes were like moist, and like I shed a tear or two at random points for basically the entirety of those last 60 pages, including the last few pages where I actually cried. It was beautiful, and for somebody who I've said multiple times now, especially in regards to Shadow Rising, who loves climaxes and loves resolutions, the Return to Adan is fantastic because it is inherently a resolution to the Prophet of Adan, because it covers all of the aftermath, all of the loose threads, and a lot of those loose threads are major threads. So it is the resolution of those threads over a long book, and itself actually resolves all those threads amazingly and does a very good job of really hitting emotionally. Like I said, I had watery eyes for a couple hours continuously this morning reading the end of this book, and this is part of the reason why I'm actually excited to get to the end of Wheel of Time eventually, because I doubt that I'll be able to get through that last book without just, you know, wanting to die the entire time because of how much I'm crying. But Return to Adan really hit for me emotionally and plot-wise and thematically, and there are some really cool and interesting decisions that I didn't expect Philip to make in here that I really respected. Like I said, it brought back the magic of The Way of Adan. I just really loved this book. I'm gonna probably put this here, just under Ashes of Man, as base. It could nearly be my favorite book of the year. These two are hands down my three favorite books, or my two favorite books of the year. The Dragon Reborn would probably is my third favorite book of the year, not counting Howling Dark. So Return to Adan fully deserves that spot. I can't wait for whatever book Philip will be releasing this year, and I can't wait to talk to him about these books. At the time that this video releases, I think I actually just did my discussion with Philip. I think that released 2 days ago. That might be when the scheduling for that happened. Yeah, my Author Talks discussion with Philip Chase just came out 2 days ago at the time of this video's release, and at the time I'm recording this, I haven't recorded that yet. I haven't talked with him yet, but I'm super excited for that because I loved this trilogy, and I can't wait to reread it in full sometime fairly soon. But the Return to Adan was just incredible. That's really all there is to it. And now, since we're running along on this video, I didn't realize that this one would be so much longer than the last few. Let's just briefly talk about the three things that I'm going to put in not enough time because I didn't finish them. Anna Karenina, I started on a whim in the middle of December when maybe I shouldn't have, but I'm glad I did because I've really enjoyed it so far. I'm basically through the end of part 2 or so by the time I'm recording this at the very end of December. So I'm not an insignificant way through the book, but I'm not nearly far enough to be like, I'm close enough to done to be able to rank this, so I can't do that, obviously, and I'm not going to do that. So this is what I'm going to put here because I really enjoyed that of what I've read so far. The Silmarillion I haven't finished yet. I was working through that for part of the year before a lot of other reads kind of got in the way. It's like, this is a little bit more important. So Silmarillion I hope to continue a little bit in 2024, but I can't guarantee that I'll be able to finish it in 2024. I would like to, and I hope to, just to kind of cut off that loose end. And Anna Karenina I would like to finish in January. We'll see what happens. Obviously this book comes out this video comes out in February, so if you want to know whether I actually finished Anna Karenina in January or not, wait for next Tuesday's video, the monthly reading wrap up and TBR, where I'll discuss those things. And then this complete Tales and Poems of Edgar Allan Poe thing here, I'm actually going to technically rate somewhere, because while I didn't read any of the tales, I didn't read any of the short stories in here, I did read all of the poetry. And it's kind of weird to go ahead and rank the poetry, but I'm going to put the poetry probably like here, because there are some poems in there that maybe are not great or are forgettable or that I didn't really understand, but the poems that I really liked from Edgar Allan Poe in here, I really liked. In fact, there's one of them that is just 2 lines. It's like, oh, I don't know, it's like 10 words or so, somewhere around 10 to 15 words, maybe even less. It's 2 lines. It's my favorite poem by him. Deep in Earth is what it's called. It is so good. But even the, more full-length poems, such as like The Raven, which I initially thought was an overrated poem, but then it became high up on my list there. I did a top 10 Edgar Allan Poe poems video actually earlier this year, so if you want to know more about that, you can totally check out that video. But yeah, I'm going to go ahead and rank the poems of Edgar Allan Poe here specifically, because I haven't actually done any of the tales, although I've probably read 1 or 2 by the time this video comes out. We'll see. But yeah, this is more or less my final take on my 2023 reading. Again, like I said in the very first video, this isn't necessarily a definitive, each one of these books I like better than the next one that appears, or I think is a better book than the next one that appears. There's kind of a complex, like, sort of distinction that I'm putting there. It's like, maybe I think Fahrenheit 451 is better than 20,000 Leagues, but I think I might, have a more special place in my heart for 20,000 Leagues versus Fahrenheit, for example. I might think that, Gregor and the Marks of Secret isn't necessarily a better book than, like, Empire of Silence is, but I enjoyed it a lot, maybe even a lot more than I actively enjoyed Empire of Silence while reading it, so maybe I put it there. And maybe some of these are just relative to their series. Maybe I think that Gregor and the Marks of Secret and Curse of the Warmbloods are just really good books, and maybe they're not, going to inherently be a lot better than a lot of these other books because they're meant for a totally different audience, but they're just kind of where they're at. But I'm going to stop rambling now and just kind of let this be the tier list. I really enjoyed my reading in 2023. There was a lot of great stuff that I read. I'm not sure whether I would mark this year above 2022 or not. I probably would, because there are so many great books that I read in 2023, including doing rereads and including having certain reading opportunities that I've had that I otherwise wouldn't have had if not for certain things that happened this year. But it's been a great year. But thank you guys for watching. Thank you guys who have stuck around on the channel for a while, or if this is, one of your first videos on the channel, thank you for checking it out, and I hope you enjoy your stay if you decide to do so. But I'll again stop rambling here. I'll see you guys on Tuesday for the monthly reading wrap up and TBR for February. Like I said, if you want to know more about some of my reading plans and whether I finished Anna Karenina or not, we'll see. You can do so in that video. But thank you again for watching. I appreciate all of you guys for checking this out. I'll see you all in the next video.